Big developments in an upstate murder case. A bond hearing was held for different defendants with dramatically different outcomes. Also, developments in the Murdoch murders crime and corruption saga, potential stalling tactics by the state, and new questions about the integrity of the ongoing investigation into jury tampering allegations against former clerk of court Becky Hill. Also, geopolitical drama all over the map, falling stocks, falling poll numbers for President Donald Trump, and repercussions across South Carolina. It was a huge week in Palmetto politics, a state which again drives much of the debate at the national level. I'm Will Folks, the founding editor and owner of FITSNews.com. Thanks to everyone for checking into our week in review. Let's dive in. So one of the cases that we have been following incredibly closely over the last few months is the August 2024 murder of Jessica Barnes. Jessica was mixed up in what can only be described as a twisted love quadrangle involving two other women and her accused murderer, 22-year-old Brandon Barnes, her husband, a man with a history of abuse allegations. Now, rather than go through the whole background of this case, Solicitor Micah Black from Anderson County detailed exactly what prosecutors allege happened in this case in open court this past week at a bond hearing. Here's Solicitor Black laying out what transpired according to the state.
Your Honor, this occurred back in August of 2024. Law enforcement got a call, I believe, on September 10th in reference to the victim's case, Ms. Jessica Barnes missing. Pendleton Police Department started doing an investigation on missing persons. They ultimately had SLED involved about a week later on September 17th. SLED became involved and started questioning several individuals. Ms. Mims lived with her grandfather in the city of Pendleton on her grandfather's property. They lived in a pool house. Ms. Mims lived out there. Ms. Tippett had just recently moved in about a week before that. And Mr. Barnes also lived out there as well. The grandfather lived in the main house. Ms. Mims did have a minor child by Mr. Brandon Barnes, and the three of those women, as well as the child, lived out there in this pool house. What really kind of broke this case open, Your Honor, is Ms. Mims, my grandfather, became, I guess, concerned about her safety, and then he was also concerned about these two particular vehicles that Ms. Mims and Mr. Barnes drove. He had a financial interest in both vehicles, so he ended up putting a GPS tracking device on both of those vehicles. And he ended up turning that information, that lodging information, to law enforcement. And as they were going back and looking at where these vehicles were traveling to, they determined that the vehicle in question, one of the vehicles in question, had gone out to this address on Twin Lakes Road in Pickens County, just right over the county line with Pickens County. Numerous occasions between August the 2nd and August the 4th. They ended up going out to that location, SLED law enforcement. They got coroner from Pickens County as well as an pathologist from Clemson. They went out there and discovered some human remains. They had a dog that helped alert that. That was ultimately sent off for testing, and it was determined that human remains from Ms. Barnes was located at that location. Law enforcement ended up putting a trail camera out there, and they did see three co-defendants go out to that location at some point after the fact, and they had actually gotten back. They actually got in one of the vehicles and took off kind of across the country, did about a week-long pursuit or so out west, and then ultimately came back. So when they came back, they actually captured them on the trail camera back out there at the location where Ms. Barnes' body was burned, and they did find some remains out there. Law enforcement ultimately, while they took some time to confirm that was human remains, they all three co-defendants in for questioning at the Clemson Police Department on October the 1st. They separated all these individuals and ultimately questioned them. As far as Ms. Mims, Ms. Mims did give a statement, Your Honor, and I will say that she was, in comparison to the other two co-defendants, she was much more forthcoming with law enforcement. She didn't necessarily beat around the bush and lie. She apologized and explained that she had been at work that day. When she got back home from work, she did see Ms. Barnes' body in the tote that she had already been placed in the tote. She did admit to helping dispose of the body. but she did indicate to law enforcement that she was not there when it happened. She did explain to law enforcement a lot of background information. I'm sure his wife was innocent died related to how Mr. Barnes treated her because they did have a child in common. So that there was some information about how not only he treated Ms. Mims, but Ms. Barnes and Ms. Tippett as well. She gave that background information. She did, I guess, lie on kind of two different occasions. She was confronted with that. She denied going to Lowe's to kind of retrieving additional material to help dispose of the body on August the 6th, and they confronted her with that, with her being on video. She ultimately did admit that she was there when they occurred. And she also denied going back out there to the scene of the Barnes body was burned, and obviously there was evidence showing that she was there as well. So those are the kind of the two parts that she wasn't forthright with law enforcement, but again, comparing her statement to the other two co-defendants, she was much more cooperative and not necessarily trying to hide information from law enforcement. But again, she, by all accounts, she was not present in this moment when she was killed.
I'm going to bring in our Jen Wood, who has been tracking this case from the very beginning. Jen, you heard Solicitor Black lay out what transpired. Walk us through this hearing and exactly what was at stake for these two defendants.
So this week, both Victoria Tippett and Kendall Mims had bond hearings. For Victoria Tippett, her hearing was on Monday. It was her first attempt since her initial arrest to get bond. This was Kendall on Thursday. This was Kendall's second attempt for bond. She had gone in front of another circuit court judge in December. Her family made some very heartfelt arguments for her release, but the judge at that time ultimately, it was a different judge, ultimately ruled that he didn't have enough information about the actual crimes to make that determination and that she could apply again in 3 months, which she did. For me, the difference in the two young women was clearly the family support and community support that Kendall Mims went into the second hearing with. Jessica's mother, Cecilia Barbera, wrote a very heartfelt letter in support of Kendall's bond, but she did not do that for Victoria Tippett. In addition, the community, her church community, multiple members of her church community, as well as Pendleton Police Chief Robert Crosby also wrote letters in support of her bond. So I do think that made a very big impact on Judge Salvini as she determined whether or not Kendall should get bond, and did ultimately give her a $75,000 surety bond.
Well, and the prosecutor also pointed out in making his comments to Judge Salvini that Kendall Mims was more cooperative, at least, than Victoria Tippett, the other co-defendant in this case. So, Jen, it was not only the community, the mother of the victim, but also the prosecutor pointing out that, hey, Judge, they all have allegedly broken the law, but at least in Kendall Mims' case, she was more forthcoming than Victoria Tippett related to the aftermath of this just horrific crime, Jen. But let's we got a clip here of Judge Salvini issuing her decision regarding the bonds. Let's cut to that real quick.
And I had an opportunity to review the letters. When it comes to granting the bonds, the laws that was remain out in the community pending a charge, is there any charge? The primary consideration is whether or not she's a danger to the community, whether or not she's a flight risk. And I don't see either one of those present with Ms. Smith. So I'm going to grant her request for bonds. Now let's talk about what's reasonable. You're telling her she's going to live with her grandfather?
Yes, ma'am. And Your Honor, we consent to GPS and
GPS monitoring, strict house arrest, no contact with co-defendants.
yes,
At
ma'am.
all, zero contact.
I don't think she wants to do that.
I just want to reiterate that I'm taking a chance on her, and her family's here to support her. She wasn't present at this occurrence. She's been cooperative. She's got the support. One jail call, and her bond's revoked. It's not even a motion, it's a warrant for her arrest.
So, Jen, anything in her decision surprise you?
I wasn't, I really did think that Kendall had a good opportunity to get bond granted. But when I saw that Victoria was going in front of the judge earlier that week, I wasn't quite sure how that would factor into the judge's decision. Could she grant one bond and not the other one bond? They're accused of the same crime. But when the judge noted that, it really for her comes down to, is she a danger to the community and is she a flight risk? And, those were the two key factors that she was looking at. So it does make sense once she explained her decision, which I thought she did very well.
Indeed. Again, though, at the end of the day, we have two defendants, as you mentioned, accused of the same crimes. Attorneys for both of those defendants arguing that they are both victims of Brandon Barnes. And so it was a very similar case made by both attorneys. Catherine Weiss obviously arguing it very effectively for her client, Kendall Mims. And in fact, we've got a clip after the hearing. Kendall Mims' father spoke with our Dylan Nolan, flanked by Catherine Weiss, her attorney. Here's an excerpt from that clip.
Praise God that Kendall's going to get to come and see her baby that she's missed so long. We praise God for Catherine and her staying by us and seeing Kendall for who she is. She continued prayers that Kendall will be able to become our baby again. She's gone through a whole lot, and we're just excited that she can come home and also continue to offer support. Our heart goes out for the family that lost their daughter, and maybe Kendall, in her experience as a victim, can help others in some way, and maybe this system here can get a little bit better. Court system I'm talking about. So, but thank you so much, and we feel like this is a sort of a win. So praise God.
So, Jen, this is a very emotional case, obviously a very layered case. You've been following this again for some time. How convoluted, how complicated, how deep does this thing really go when we start looking at all the personalities that are involved, all of the relationships, all of the manipulation, all of the lies? I mean, this is just, it's still, we're unwinding all of this story, aren't we?
Yeah, I mean, for me, this case is especially fascinating because I have been able to hear from the defendants, and it really gave me a different perspective of the legal system and of, there's a lot of gray areas with this case. Kendall had been in what I do believe was a very abusive, very controlling relationship for a very long time. And part of what kept her there was the fact that she had an infant daughter with Brandon Barnes, the man alleged to have killed Jessica Barnes. So yeah, this is a fascinating case in that we do get into a lot of that coercive control aspects that have come out, in the Micah Miller case. I see a lot of parallels, but it's very different. Victoria Tippett is a whole different personality in this case, because she really only came into the picture 2 weeks before Jessica's death. So I don't think there was as much of that controlling behavior that she was exposed to. But, she had to have been very frightened by what was going on, one would assume.
Yeah, obviously this is, some of the graphic details were not included in the solicitor's recap that we heard earlier, but this is just an incredibly graphic case. Obviously a death by strangulation, dismemberment of Jessica Barnes' body. It was then burned, dumped by a boat ramp about 4 miles west of the pool house where these 4 young people were living together. Obviously, we've hinted about this in prior coverage, but Jen, she had a pregnancy end with a stillbirth that some have made allegations of abuse connected to that. So just so many layers, so many lives tied up in this just horrific tale. You've done amazing work on it, Jen. Our Dylan Nolan was up in Anderson County this week for these hearings. We're going to continue to follow this case incredibly closely as it moves forward. But I want to pivot here, Jen, and bring us to a story we addressed again last week. The latest chapter in the Murdoch murders crime and corruption saga story FITSNews obviously is covered from the very beginning. But we spoke last week, Jen, about a request made by Attorney General Alan Wilson's office, the lead prosecutor on that case, for another 120-day extension in responding to Murdoch's appeal. Now, Jen, this was granted at the last minute this week by the South Carolina State Supreme Court, even after Murdoch's attorneys had said, justices, these guys have done nothing on this case. Were you surprised the Supreme Court granted Wilson's office another extension, Jen?
Was I surprised? No. Was I disappointed? Yes, absolutely. Their response was initially due in January, early January, and they requested a 90-day extension, which was promptly granted. That to me made sense. They need a little extra time. But about 10 days before April 9th was when it was due this time after that extension. And about 10 days before that, I saw a filing that they had ordered the transcript from the hearing in front of Chief Justice Toll, the evidentiary hearing, to determine.
Wait, Jen, hold on a second. Are you telling me that 10 days before they were due to respond to the appeal, that's when they first requested the transcript of that hearing?
Yes. I was in the middle of writing a very lengthy piece, and I saw that, and I was like, I bet you they are going to ask for another extension. And sure enough,
obviously.
Sure enough, about 2 days later, they asked for a 120-day extension.
So they've obviously had time to go film new documentary segments on their big victory on this case, and certainly, credit where credit's due. They did an amazing job on this case. Nobody's saying the Attorney General's office didn't do a great job prosecuting this case, but the question becomes the arguments raised in Alec Murdaugh's appeal, are they valid? Take away the job that the prosecutors did. It's not really about that anymore. It's about whether or not there is merit to these arguments. And Jen, we focus so much on the jury tampering angle. We're going to talk about some developments in that part of this case in just a moment, but you made the point repeatedly, Jen, that that's not the only argument that Murdoch's attorneys are making in this appeal. There's several other arguments that you've discussed. Walk us through a few of those, Jen.
Like I said, it was a 132-page brief from Murdoch's attorneys, and it was a very good brief. Like them or not, there's a lot of opinions on that. They wrote a very substantive appeal brief. And among those issues outside of the jury tampering that they raised that I think are compelling involve the admittance of the financial crimes by Circuit Court Judge Clifton Newman, whether or not those are considered prior bad acts. Did he open the door for those crimes to come in? A lot of people argue he did, but it is a very good point that they've made. In addition to that, we're looking at questions about the forensic evidence that came in, specifically the ballistics done on the firearms that killed both Maggie and Paul Murdoch that have never been found. So they argued that bullets found on a different part of the property, the markings on it matched those on the markings of the bullets that killed Maggie and Paul. Was that evidence scientifically sound? Was the process used to get that evidence scientifically sound? They also threw in the cellular forensic expert that they brought in as a rebuttal witness, whether or not that evidence should have been admitted. This expert from Charleston, Paul McManigal, spent the weekend throwing a phone around to determine if the backlight on the phone would light up. That went directly to whether or not when Maggie Murdoch's phone ended up on the side of the road, when it was thrown from whatever vehicle it was thrown from, the backlight would have gone. If they did not get that expert in, their timeline, the state's timeline regarding Alex Murdoch's alibi in that phone doesn't make sense anymore.
Yeah, so there's some key components raised by that appeal. Certainly, though, Jen, as we talk through them, obviously those would be debated one by one whenever this case goes before the state Supreme Court. But the jury tampering remains the one that, as of now anyway, has been essentially proven by the evidentiary hearing that was held last January. So, we can talk about the guns. We can talk about the timeline. We can talk about that cell phone being thrown. We can talk about all those things, and certainly the financial crimes being admitted, probably, I would argue, the biggest component of the appeal that's not related to the jury tampering. But ultimately, what we know for a fact already is that multiple jurors have testified that the sitting clerk of court at the time, Becky Hill, tried to sway them, and that one of them said it did sway her. It did sway her. And so that, Jen, how is that not game, set, match when it comes to this appeal?
For me, it should have been, whether or not, came down to the standard that Chief Justice Toll determined she was going to use. And to me, it should have been game, set, match. But I'm not the one making that ruling. I think when this goes to appeal, if it isn't overturned by, if the verdict isn't,
If we ever get there,
right? Well, yeah, that's a good point.
the state ever quits taking victory laps and actually reads the transcript and files a response.
I mean, I think even if he isn't granted a new trial at the state level, he has a very good chance at the federal level. I mean, it is what it is. That it wasn't a fair trial in my eyes.
Yeah. And let's dig a little deeper in that, because obviously there's delay going on as it relates to the appeal itself. But also, let's not forget, there's an ongoing investigation into multiple people that were tied to this. Becky Hill, the clerk of court, former clerk of court down in Colleton County, she is under investigation. What's happening with that case? Her son had been arrested previously on charges that we don't know exactly what the relation is to the Murdaugh saga, but certainly it was tied to something involving his mom. We've got allegations against Curtis Eddie Smith, Alec Murdaugh's check casher and alleged drug runner. He was supposed to be a star witness at the trial. He was on standby for the state, was never called, and yet after the trial, very quickly thereafter, was granted bond on the charges he has been facing for several years now. Jen, they're running out the clock. Does it not feel like that? I mean, every time we look at this case and the slow rolling of it, whether it's on the court side with the appeal or whether it's with these subsequent adjacent investigations, it just feels like everybody wants this story to go away.
Everybody who has a vested interest in that verdict wants the story to go away. I think they're banking on Murdoch fatigue. And, admittedly, you and I have both had it. It's just like the story is never going to end. But it's because the story isn't over. This, we don't have decades of corruption like came out in this story, and just have three parties, Russell, Corey, and Alex, accountable. I mean, there were multiple people involved in whatever was going on there. Judges
were accused of corruption and signing off on settlements improperly at a minimum.
And I think, well, we have had fatigue on this. I think it's time to get back into this and looking at the broader picture.
Well, and just this week, Attorney Joe McCulloch, who represents several of those jurors, sent a letter to the State Law Enforcement Division asking them, are you investigating the jury tampering allegations, claiming that his clients had not yet been interviewed by SLED agents? Now, we are told that the agency will have a response to McCulloch's letter in the very near future, one which we are told will be very direct and will be a matter of public record. So certainly we want to see what SLED has to say about that allegation. But Jen, as we look at this broader pattern since those verdicts, which, by the way, isn't just jury tampering, we got to remember that. Jury tampering has been documented. That's been proven in court.
It's happened. It happened. It is what it is.
The question now is whether there was something deeper. And one of the folks that Joe McCulloch represents, Myra Crosby, gone on the record in her book and in interviews alleging that the jury was rigged, that she was lied about, and that she was thrown off of that jury because she was a holdout and because she was raising questions about Becky Hill and her tampering. So it's a huge mess. It's a huge mess. And there are a lot of folks, as you mentioned, that have a lot invested in that verdict. They want this story to be done. They want to put a bow on it. They want it to be over. But that's not how we work, is it, Jim? It's not about what we want. It's about what is the truth. It's about what is the just outcome here. And I've said it from the beginning. If you care about the process, if you care about constitutional liberty, if you care about due process and Sixth Amendment rights, you have to get this right. You have to get this right. There is no other way to proceed except with confidence in those verdicts. Because while we believe those verdicts are correct, while we believe that they are just, we believe that Alec Murdaugh is exactly where he belongs, if there are issues with how they were obtained, whether through jury tampering, whether through evidence that shouldn't have been allowed in, whether through jury rigging, whatever it is, if there are issues with those verdicts that erode their integrity, then we can no longer have confidence in them.
Right. I mean, if you can't get a just verdict in front of the audience that was watching the trial of Alec Murdaugh, can anybody get a fair trial? Can anybody?
Yeah, and
It's concerning.
It is concerning. And again, the sad thing I keep going back to is that this entire thing was about exposing corruption, institutional corruption out of that 14th Circuit in the South Carolina Low Country, that 5-county region that the Murdochs ruled for almost a century. And it was all about exposing that corruption, and it had to be exposed. It needed to be exposed. But what we are seeing in the aftermath, Jen, is a system that it looks like put its thumb on the scale in order to get it done. And we just, again, you can't have that. It's got to be done right. It's got to be done in accordance with the law. And what we are seeing in the aftermath of that with this, I call it the verdict protection racket, it is not about truth. It is not about justice. It is about people covering their asses. But hey, we've been on it from the beginning. We're going to stay on it, Jen. Your work has been indispensable to it. But some major developments over the past 2 weeks now. This is the second episode in a row that we've had to dive back into the Murdaugh saga. We're going to continue to dive in it, Jen, until they show that they are serious about advancing this case to the proper resolution. A massive week on the markets, folks. If your portfolio is anything like mine, it took a bit of a hit over the last few days. And we've also seen a bit of a hit correspondingly in the poll numbers for U.S. President Donald Trump, the first real appreciable decline in his polling numbers, Dylan Nolan, since he took office back in January. Trump always hovered, half of the people love him, half of the people hate him. Generally, that's how it works. But we've seen a little bit of the tick in the negative direction for the president over the last few weeks as the impact of the tariff debate, Liberation Day, he called it, the art of the deal, some said, as initial responses to those tariffs started flowing back. Clearly an effort by the United States to isolate China in this tariff debate. But Dylan, I want to ask you, you've got an economic background. Last week's episode, you were walking us through the intricacies of some tax reform. You've been studying this issue quite extensively, not only the economic side of it, but perhaps more importantly, the geopolitical angle of all of this, the two superpowers going against each other. Walk us through first on the market side and the tariff debate. Is Trump art of the deal in this, or has he stumbled with this tariff gambit?
So you're a big fan of Zero Hedge, and they actually had the honor this week as a part of Donald Trump's new media regime at the White House of being invited to the press briefing room. This is, a new initiative where alternative media outlets are allowed in, and I think that's pretty cool. But they published a really great article on this issue this week, and there's a great line that I love to quote here, and it says, "President Trump will get credit or blame for whatever happens next, but it was always going to happen." Meaning that the United States fiscal situation, which had Harris won, had Trump won, we're on an unsustainable debt path. This article goes on to correctly cite the fact that by 2035, the United States will be insolvent. So this decoupling, this change of the use of the dollar as the reserve currency of the world, it's a course that we're headed on either way. And the article correctly, I think, says that historians will never get to know the counterfactual of what would have happened if we kind of stayed on course with this largest bilateral trade relationship that the United States and China have developed since China's been integrated into the global economy. It's certainly going to have widespread economic impacts beyond just this week. I think what we've seen this week is only the beginning. But I do believe that the interpretation that this is something that is inevitable because of economic forces beyond the president is true. I don't, the way that he chose to deal with this, I'm not sure whether folks are going to look back on this in 50 years and say that was the right way to do it. But we are in a situation that's larger than the president in that our government is on an unsustainable course of spending, in that the world's current monetary system, which uses the dollar as the currency that we denominate all transactions in, is backed up by our military empire, which is becoming increasingly financially unsustainable. So obviously we're having these tectonic plates shifting. And, Donald Trump is arguably the most powerful man in the world, but he still is only playing the hands of card that he's been dealt.
It's interesting you say that. We were talking about this here in the office over the past week, and you talked a little bit about how, this isn't just about tariffs. It is about the interest on the debt and the excessive levels of that. And FITSNews, again, has been writing about this for, gosh, since our inception. I remember back in 2013, we published an article that we've been citing frequently since about how none of Washington's spending practices, whether it's under Republican Congresses, Democrat Congresses, Republican presidents, Democrat presidents, none of it is sustainable. We haven't had a balanced budget since Bill Clinton, before you were born.
Right. My whole lifetime, this issue has been, the balloon has been inflating.
Yeah.
Quite literally. And we are now to the point where a balloon can only take so much air.
Yeah.
Something is going to happen. And it's unclear exactly what, but I think that Trump is trying to have that balloon pop on his own terms.
So he's pushing us to the inflection point as opposed to what?
He wants to control the inflection as opposed to letting a gradual degradation where the CCP, the Chinese government, gradually infiltrates more of our finance, more of our institutions, and kind of slowly takes over. He's pushing a hard break on his own terms.
Now, let me ask you about that hard break, because we talked about this again briefly this week earlier, and you made a comment to me that I found very interesting. We were looking at the initial reactions to the Liberation Day gambit, which a lot of people coming to the table, starting with Israel, starting with a lot of our allies, coming to the table to get their new agreements negotiated. That prompted Trump to announce a 90-day pause for all of those bilateral tariffs except for China. So clearly a move to isolate the communist state in China. Let me ask you this, though. You made the comment that this raises the stakes and raises the possibility of war with China. What did you mean by that? And are you seriously arguing that we're going to be in a state of war with China as a result of this trade battle?
I mean, not only am I seriously arguing this, if you looked prior to Donald Trump taking office, prior to this obviously escalatory event, the smartest minds in our military, preparation world have been wargaming very seriously, preparing for war with China in somewhere in the year 2027. The thought with that being that China is experiencing demographic decline, and we are currently building up our forces in the Pacific region. So there's kind of this perfect point where China will have the maximum amount of military projection power before we are able to amass as much forces in that region as we would like to. That would make that kind of the perfect date for them to try to take military action if they would. But that was kind of widely believed among the military industrial complex people, if you'd like to call them that, the national security community, if you'd like to be more charitable to them. But these people very seriously are preparing for a war before 2030 with China. And you can only interpret a complete renegotiation not favorable to China with our bilateral trade relationship as something that is going to increase the likelihood of that, because the stakes for them not participating in the global economy, well, if they're going to be cut out of the global economy, at least in part, that was one of the main things that would keep peace. Because both of our nations, when we have a strong bilateral trade relationship, are not incentivized to go to war with one another.
No. Well, so basically what you're telling me is, with the money that I've lost that I can now no longer spend to take a vacation, keep the South China Sea off of the destination list, Dylan? Is that the counsel?
Well, you weren't dumb enough to sell the dip, were you? You're holding.
I'm holding. Yeah, I'm going to hold.
You're long on the U.S. economy, I would hope.
Long game player. Well, I want to shift gears. Obviously, these national developments have implications on South Carolina, because in a few years, Dylan, everyone who's going to run for Trump's job is going to have to come through the Palmetto State and make their case not only to the Republican electorate, which is the first in the South presidential primary, but the Democrats, who have their first in the nation presidential primary in South Carolina. All of those candidates are going to have to come in and tell the voters of South Carolina, here's what we're going to do. Here's our plan to react to that. So it's going to be a very interesting time following those. And in fact, one of our indexes that we're going to be following, Dylan, is going to have our first look at that early 2028 field. So we're going to start the process of assessing those candidates now. And you better believe this is going to be a big issue as it relates to their fitness to hold that office. So, but as we look forward to that, there were some big developments here in the Palmetto State for some of the statewide races. And again, these matter because these are the folks who end up endorsing those presidential candidates, who end up lending them their grassroots support when they come to the Palmetto State. So it does matter. And I tell people all the time, if you don't follow South Carolina politics, you need to, because South Carolina politics has a way of dictating what happens at the national level. Look at the last two presidents. Anyway, big news this week. A prominent South Carolina Democrat, one of the most well-known state solicitors, David Pasco from Orangeburg County, South Carolina, announced that he was switching parties, Dylan.
Indeed, he did. He did yesterday, this Thursday, as we taped this. And we've kind of had hints that Pasco might be doing this. We know that he's been working with some very powerful, very intelligent, very strategic Republican political operatives. And that's not something one typically does if they're planning on remaining in the Democrat Party. But if you look at the results here, I mean, when's the last time a Democrat won a statewide elected position?
I'm glad you asked me that. 2006, that's the last statewide victory for Democrat, but they haven't won a top of the ticket race since 1998, Dylan. It's been 27 years.
So obviously, if Pasco seriously wants this job, this is something that he had to do. He's going to be running against a lot of people who have been Republicans for their whole political career. That being said, he does have a record of supporting issues which are very popular with Republican voters, such as, being tough on crime, which obviously when you're running for a prosecutorial position, I think is quite important.
He's got a great record on that. Great record on that. He's one of the few, I think, who can credibly argue that he took a stand against public corruption. There's a big investigation a few years back, Probegate it was called. It looked into one of the prominent GOP political empires here in the Palmetto State. Now, there are those who have argued, myself included, that Pasco didn't really bring that investigation home, that he was able to take out some of the lawmakers that were allegedly involved in this pay-to-play stuff, but that he left a lot of the special interests free from prosecution, free from consequences for basically bribing these people, according to his own grand jury. So it's kind of a double-edged sword on the anti-corruption thing for David Pasco, but certainly he played it up at his announcement.
Yeah, and he would be expected to. The other thing that I've seen in recent years, Pasco has been very intelligent. I mean, he's been pushing this judicial reform issue, but the way that he did it was going around the state for the last 2 years, going to county GOP meetings and directly addressing the GOP grassroots involved individuals. He's, addressing groups of 15 to 50 people at a time, but these are the people who are taking time out of their Tuesday night to go to their county GOP meeting. These are the kind of people who are going to turn out in a primary election. And he has certainly been laying that groundwork. And he's probably more well-known among a lot of these GOP primary voters and more well-liked than, GOP state senators or other folks who have been GOP their whole political career, but the GOP primary voters might not know who they are or have any respect for what they've done because they don't know anything about it.
No, and also very interesting, the reaction to his announcement. There were several Republican solicitors, law enforcement leaders who endorsed his candidacy. He had our good friend Joe White from the Freedom Caucus at his announcement. Joe White obviously was integral in pushing the judicial reform measures that we have been able to pass. Obviously, much more needed on that front, Dylan, but he's a guy who can make some of these cases credibly with GOP primary voters. So it will be interesting to see how he is received when the inevitable attacks against him begin. Certainly the Democrats were very vocal in their criticism of Pasco's announcement. They referred to him as a political performance artist, I believe it was, and had some choice words for the new Republican elected official. Also told him, don't expect to win election to your solicitor seat again if you fail in your bid for attorney general. So kind of a all-in gamble for David Pasco, Dylan.
Yeah, I mean, if this doesn't work for him, I'm sure he could have a very successful legal practice, but I don't think he's going to have too many friends within the Democrat Party after this.
Yes, I believe one of the prominent Democrats told me that he needs to, quote, take his ass home, end quote, which was interesting. I guess maybe his argument is he's now found a new home.
Perhaps he has. I'll be very interested to hear when he goes to the debates and other public events that will precede this election, folks ask him questions about, should a Democrat be elected to office, are you really going to as doggedly pursue them as a guy like Alan Wilson has? Whatever you think of Alan Wilson, you cannot deny the fact that he has, through his Solicitor General, made dozens. I mean, he's been in office for a long time, maybe even hundreds at this point, petitions to the Supreme Court, or joined in letters with other states, other Republican attorneys general, to fight what these states believe are executive overreaches, and kind of defend what the Republican conception of states' rights. Is that something that a guy like Pasco, who, as of 2 days ago, is not in the Republican Party, will do?
No, it's a very good question. Very good question. And we're going to track those questions as that campaign emerges. You talk about those debates, we're going to be there as that race emerges. And Dylan, a lot of folks are looking at that attorney general's race as being every bit as exciting as the governor's race in South Carolina.
Arguably, it's a more powerful position.
Yeah, you could make that case. The governor in South Carolina, a very weak executive, given the control of the legislative branch. Let's talk a little bit about that governor's race now. And I do the Pasco thing, a huge development beyond just the office that he's going to seek. I mean, it's obvious he's going to announce for attorney general. He didn't do it this past week, but that's coming. But beyond the office that he seeks, his decision, just another indicator of the extent to which Republicans, and I got to bring out my baby quotes again, Dylan. Every week we do it, we say Republicans, because so many of them are party switchers or similar to the old Democrat politicians that ran the state for decades. They didn't change their ideology when they switched parties. In other words, the same sort of big government, big tax mentality that they brought to office when they were Democrats that continued as Republicans. Now, the argument with Pasco, I think, is, do we want him to change his stripes? If this is a guy who has a record of putting violent criminals behind bars, of taking victims seriously, standing up for their rights, aren't those values that are not bound by party?
Yeah, and the other thing is, I think it would be good to have somebody who is not cozy with the swamp creatures in the State House, the corruption-prone, if David's not very friendly with them, that could certainly lead to some more Probegate-style investigations coming from the AG's office, should he be elected to that position.
Yeah, no doubt. Speaking of victims, crime victims, alleged crime victims, there were developments this week regarding one of the gubernatorial frontrunners in this race. Nancy Mace made a big deal about the arrest of one of the four men whom she accused on a floor speech in the U.S. House of Representatives of being a sexual predator. Eric Bowman of Sullivan's Island, South Carolina, was arrested this week by Sullivan's Island Police Department officers, booked at the Charleston County Detention Center, charged with harassment and stalking. But Dylan, it wasn't exactly the way that Mace phrased it. We got the picture up here, the captured image Nancy put all over her social media.
Captured? The guy turned himself in.
But indicating that one of the four people she accused had been brought to justice. There's a little bit of conflation going on here, Dylan.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the charges, it's actually not related to Congresswoman Mace. It's related to his ex-wife.
Correct. And in fact, that was all over his social media feed before the arrest, and literally within an hour of him being released, he was...
But let's talk about this guy's social media feed. I started following him the day after Nancy Mace's speech because this guy has been going ballistic on Twitter. Yeah. I mean, his defense attorney must be very unhappy with him because he just keeps saying things which, if I were the prosecution in this case, I would be shoving right back in his face.
Yeah, it's been very interesting to watch the different responses of these four individuals whom Mace accused in that, quote, scorched earth speech in the U.S. House. You've got, obviously, Eric Bowman just balls to the wall, putting it all out there, accusing Mace of attending sex parties with porn stars. And how much truth is there, we don't know, but clearly just that's one reaction to being accused. Then on the other hand, you've got Brian Musgrove, who hired Eric Bland and Ronnie Richter, sent a cease and desist letter, no response to that. Then they filed a lawsuit against
a little bit more
Mace.
Serious of a response.
I would argue, yes, a more serious response. But very interesting to watch this unfold. And again, it's happening, Dylan, against the backdrop of a criminal investigation. However, SLED very quick to point out this past week that the arrest of Eric Bowman had nothing to do with their ongoing investigation of the allegations that Mace leveled on the floor of the House. So they were calling out that conflation a little bit, Dylan, in their official response to that arrest.
Yeah, I'm sure that they don't want to be associated with political grandstanding if that's how they view it.
Let's talk, though, about the impact of this on the governor's race, because Mace entered this contest along with the Attorney General Alan Wilson, along with the Lieutenant Governor Pam Yvette to a lesser degree, as one of the three real front runners. And in fact, Wilson and Mace arguably a notch above where the Lieutenant Governor Pam Yvette has been.
Except for in the poll that she paid for.
Except, oh man, we got to dog out our friend Robert Cayley. You know, guy, everybody gets, you say acorns, blind hogs and acorns, get it right every once in a while. Well, Robert Cayley, I guess, gets it wrong every once in a while, because usually an incredibly reliable pollster, Robert Cayley. But yeah, that one.
She brought the bag.
She brought the bag. But what do you think, Dylan, about the impact of this on Nancy Mace's trajectory in the governor's race? The early returns, it feels like it's not helping her.
Yeah, I mean, we've only seen one poll since then, and it showed that she had dropped a pretty significant amount. I would like to see another poll. Hopefully somebody else has got one coming. We made the joke around the office. Well, where's the poll that Nancy paid for? She's got one that she says Alan paid for. They got one they say Pam paid for.
Time for Nancy's, yeah.
Yeah, time for Nancy to pony up and get a poll that shows her with, 75% support or whatever. But
what would you advise her, though? If you're running her race today, what would you tell her to do?
Stick to the facts. And I'm sure that she believes that she's doing that. And I'm sure that if I push that point too hard, I'd probably be booted from her service, because it seems like, there's a high turnover rate there. But I think folks, if it turns out that this is not true, or even not completely true, I mean, she made very serious allegations, and that's hard to walk back.
Yeah. Well, and she has a potential, wouldn't you agree, looking at this field? And again, we like DAG as far as a lot of the things he's done during his time in office. Obviously, we've been very critical of him on some other things. But isn't there a case to be made that of the front runners, Mace would be more likely to be the sort of change agent in the governor's office that's necessary? Again, you don't have a lot of power in that office except for the bully pulpit. Clearly, she knows how to use the bully pulpit. Wouldn't she be a good fit if she could get past some of this soap opera drama?
I think that she would certainly be the best one for folks in our profession. She would not be afraid to go to the media and beat the hell out of the legislature if they're not doing what she wants them to do. And I do think that she's very effective at leveraging the media to get her message across. So yeah, that would certainly, she would probably be able to exert more leverage than anybody else in the field, just because she would not give a damn about bruising relationships with people that I think that Wilson or Yvette would want to protect their relationships with.
Indeed. But to do that, she's got to get there first. And obviously, the early returns.
It seems as though this gambit is not playing off.
Yeah, early returns indicate that
But there are so many months before this Republican primary that this could all be far in the rearview mirror.
Correct. And still other candidates to announce. In fact, we've heard that U.S. Congressman Ralph Norman very seriously considering jumping into the race. He would be a favorite of the Freedom Caucus, both nationally and here in the Palmetto State, a guy who clearly would have his own resources to bring to the race as well. He could be a formidable contender. There are also reports that Ram Reddy, the founder of Doge SC, which has been generating a ton of attention over the last few weeks and months, Doge SC generating a lot of reaction from lawmakers, positive and negative. But Ram Reddy potentially could throw his hat in the ring if sources are to be believed. So you never know, Dylan. This field's still very much in flux, even though we've got Mace, Wilson, and Yvette as kind of the established three front runners.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see if some outside well-funded candidate comes in.
Yeah, it could change the whole dynamic. Well, Dylan, obviously a big week in Palmetto politics. We've got the treasurer of South Carolina headed to a date with destiny, it would appear. We had him in the studio not long ago. Curtis Loftus has been elected since 2010, ran on a platform of transparency, but some senators are claiming he's been less than transparent in his financial dealings. Obviously, we sat down with him. He made a very compelling case that, look, I'm the state's banker. I cut the checks and handle the investments. You want problems with the bottom line, you got to talk to the comptroller. But Dylan, we were talking earlier about how weak the executive branch in South Carolina is. How is this not just another push by the legislature to control who holds those key financial offices? Because again, the treasurer, he can put the kibosh on a lot of their borrowing, on a lot of the fiscal maneuvering that they have to undertake to get some of the approval they need for their bond rating. I mean, he's a powerful man in a powerful position.
Yeah, and more importantly, he's independently elected by the citizens of the state of South Carolina. He's a statewide elected official, and he's not controlled by these folks in the legislature. But I think that he makes that case far more effectively than I can. So what I'm going to do right now is, folks, if you're watching on a cell phone or you're watching on YouTube, there will be a link right now that you can click and go directly to this interview that we conducted with Treasurer Loftus. I know you might think it's boring. It's about finance. It's not. It's about the power dynamic in this state, and it's about somebody who's independently elected, trying to be a check on the legislative folks who accumulate almost all of the power in the states into the hands of very few folks who have not that much direct accountability to the voters of South Carolina, considering they're only being elected themselves by one district of voters. So that's a very interesting interview, more so than folks who aren't interested in finance and dollars and cents might think.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, he does touch on a lot of those obligations and the financial component of what he does, but it was a very, I thought, he's fighting for his life, fighting for his political life, and he's making the case, hey, I'm the only one standing in the gap between you and these.
And our readers can assess the credibility. They can assess his credibility. They can listen to it for themselves and decide how they feel about that.
Absolutely. Well, be sure to check that interview out. Obviously, that day is coming for Curtis Loftus, April 21st. State senators are expected to take up the question of whether or not they should vote him out of office. Loftus has preemptively gone to the state Supreme Court, challenging their authority to do so under the state constitution. It'll be very interesting to see whether the court grants those arguments and issues a decision. Obviously, time is of the essence here. So we're going to be tracking not only that court development, but the legislative trial, which could unfold in its aftermath, Dylan. Just a hugely dramatic week at the South Carolina State House on multiple fronts. Folks, again, if you don't follow Palmetto politics, you should. A lot of these issues directly impact the national scene, where candidates are going on the national scene. FITSNews, founded as a South Carolina political website, also one that has an open mic policy on all of these issues, whether you're talking about Trump tariffs, the Attorney General's race, the governor's race, or the current drama swirling around the state treasurer. Here at FITSNews, we welcome all intelligent takes on these issues. So if you've got a perspective you'd like to share, we are more than happy to run it. And we've done so on all those races and all those issues from multiple perspectives. But again, for us, that is the key to our coverage, hosting a conversation and, again, inviting all intelligent takes from points all on the political spectrum. Dylan, thanks for sitting down with me this week, and a lot to look forward to in the weeks ahead.
Thank you, Will.
All right, that is a wrap for this week's edition. I want to thank everybody for taking the time to tune in. Once again, if you want to support the journalism that we do here at FITSNews, please subscribe to our site. You can go to FITSNews.com and subscribe today, but your support empowers everything we do here. Speaking of that, a couple big interviews I want to tease right now. We've got one of our favorite commentators, attorney Ali Benevento from the Strom Law Firm, will be in the studio later this month to debate me on the issue of capital punishment. Yes, I'm fully aware that I'll probably lose that. Also, we've got a big Murdoch-related interview coming up much later this month that we're very excited. Can't tell you all the details at this point, but you are not going to want to miss it. So keep it tuned to FITSNews.com. And once again, thanks for visiting the Week in Review.